Hi there. Today I'd like to talk to you about what it was like to write the daily report in the mission in El Salvador and what importance it had. So, I'm not sure how I got selected to be the military observer that would write the daily report. I was not sent out to one of the field stations. I was in the headquarters, and my job basically was to take 28 pages of fairly hysterical field reporting and condense it to no more than a page and a half and no less than a page that would go to New York by noon on the day that it was submitted. So the reports came in overnight. We arrived at work 7:30, 8 o'clock, and I had 4 hours to digest the regional reports and condense them into one mission report. Small problem, all the reports were written in Spanish, and whilst I could order 2 beers and say my friend will pay in Spanish, getting into the nuances of the language was totally beyond me. So, as one does in these situations, I started to farm out part of the job, and I approached a couple of the secretaries who also worked as interpreters and translators and said, if I buy the coffee, can we sit and go over these reports, and I'll make my notes in English about what they mean and how they are, and you'll help me with the nuances of the language. They loved it. And within a very few days, suddenly others were coming up to me and saying, can we join the coffee club? I said, the more the merrier. I really appreciated it. I needed the help. There was no way I was going to get this done on my own. So within 3-4 weeks, we'd settled into a very comfy routine. We would go to a quiet place. I would get a tray of coffees. Sometimes I didn't even want a coffee. And they would sit around the table with the different reports. And they would, it was a completely bilingual setup. They would jibber jabber away in Spanish, then they would chat in English. And then amongst them, whoever was the lead on that particular issue would say, well, this is what we agree that we think it means. This is what they're saying. And I would make my notes. Now you have to understand that for some of the reporters out in the field, it was very tedious, boring sort of stuff. And they liked to make the most of anything they had. It was not uncommon for a routine report of a routine meeting with one of the commandantes to be something like, as the blue smoke curled lazily from his cigarette, he looked at me enigmatically and said, what do you think that means? And I told him my analysis of the situation, or something like that. None of that was of interest to United Nations headquarters, New York. And so I had to find a polite way of getting 28 pages of that down to a page and a half of the actual report that would be signed by the Chief of Mission and go to the operations desk in New York and be viewed by all of the staff. It would be distributed to all of the appropriate staff who were dealing with that mission. So what were the really substantive things that the observers were looking at? So this slide shows you some arms that were in a cache in the jungle, and you can see in the top right-hand corner of the slide the boot of one of the observers that is actually looking at whilst his looking at the arms and the ammunition, whilst his friend is his compatriot is photographing it. First things first. All of the weapons you can see there, all of the munitions you can see there, would have been more dangerous to the people that set them off than they would have been to the enemy they were aimed at. Right beside the boot, you see something that looks a bit like a huge chunk of a round of cheese. That was the one weapon that the FMLN had that they really put fear into the government forces about. It was called the Rayo de Muerte, the ray of death, the death ray. And it wasn't a death ray at all. It was a shaped charge that fired all kinds of shrapnel and ball bearings and was designed to shred a soft-skinned truck as used by the army to ferry 12 to 20 soldiers, depending on the amount of kit they had with them around. And ambush points would be set up on the roads, and this was the sort of thing that had been used during the active fighting to to take out soft-skin vehicles. No use whatsoever against armored vehicle, but as the Salvadorian army had very few armored vehicles, it was a weapon that the soldiers were very scared of. Most important point, though, is that none of those weapons could be used properly. So I'm putting that to you because the real issue about these daily reports is, firstly, so that the real seniors in New York could see whether there was progress being made, or more importantly, whether a setback had occurred and we were actually falling back from the peace plan. Secondly, amongst the parties, the information was shared, although not photographs and not specific names and dates and places, such that it was a confidence-building measure. And confidence-building measures aren't always what they seem to be. I've covered this in other places, but we were reporting on the confidence-building measures. And so we had to be very careful that we told the truth, but that we were neither optimistic nor pessimistic. And of course, optimists and pessimists are the two clans that analysts are split into. So when these reports would get to New York, the optimists would read it one way and the pessimists would read it another. The fact is that the military process in El Salvador was more observed than not. It was an extremely good process, but we knew the weaknesses where we were being shown weapons that were not for actual use, they were for actual counting. The area where we always had trouble was in the human rights monitoring, which was an element of the mission that never really integrated into the peace process because it was filled with lawyers who were caseworkers, and this would have been great once the peace had been signed, but before the peace was signed, it was an extremely difficult and unhappy relationship. If we now go to the Cynefin framework, I'll show you what I mean by all of this. In the obvious domain, the situation report, as I've said, was used to measure the rate of change and to describe confidence-building measures in the field and to describe the verification reports, given the need not to directly counteract the claim that what they were being shown were operational weapons. Very often they were not, but we had ways of putting that in the right terms so that they would understand in New York. And that was what most people saw and what most people thought about. However, in New York, there were experienced analysts who had been in the field before. However, as I've said, that they split between optimists and pessimists, and that made the complicated really quite a difficult domain. The experts, when they don't agree, have all sorts of issues between them, and you just have to live with that when you're out in the field. Again, you have to be careful what you say, that you don't appear to be either optimistic or pessimistic. You must write in a neutral voice. And if you're going to err at all, err on the side of the peace process. With the evolution of the peace process in the complex domain, we wanted the parties, the combatant parties, to take more and more responsibility for their actions, for the process. And so, as the mission matured, the daily report would spend more time talking about how the parties were reacting to various issues rather than the actual mechanics and the actual numbers in the different issues. This was a very evolutionary process, very adaptive process, and we didn't handle it as well as we could have done if we'd understood the idea of catalytic probes and safe-to-fail experiments. The only time in a mission like El Salvador that you had chaos was an act of bad faith. Interestingly, I don't recall a single chaotic event caused by an act of bad faith on the part of the combatant parties. However, sometimes deliberately and sometimes quite unintentionally, the donors could cause a lot of trouble. If they had promised money for police reform and then their budget was such that they had to cut how much they were going to give to police reform, the plans made and the fact that the parties were relying on police reform, certainly it was a major demand by the FMLN, If you then had to cut the police reform budget because a donor had not come through with the money that they had promised, it was almost like firing a torpedo into the peace process. So the chaotic we had to deal with in this peacekeeping issue had nothing to do with the combatant parties. It had to do with those supporting the combatant parties, the donors primarily. And that basically spins us through the Genevan framework and writing the daily report and what it meant in the mission in El Salvador.